welcome everyone to the Institute for Corporate Governance and Ethics Spring 2026 Speaker Series. I'm Todd Haw, Associate Professor of Business Law and Ethics at the Kelley School and the Faculty Director of the ICGE. And I'm thrilled to be joined today by my colleague, Sunil Bedi, who will introduce our speaker, Abe Singer, and his talk, Why Business Ethics is Political, in just a moment. But before I turn things over to Sunil, I'd like to say just a quick word about the ICGE. So the Institute for Corporate Governance and Ethics takes a broad, interdisciplinary, and systems-based approach to corporate governance and ethics research. So not only do we consider corporate governance in its full scope, which includes the areas of finance, management, corporate law, corporate compliance, business and behavioral ethics, and financial controls, but we also aim to make that research accessible to business practitioners. So as part of that effort, last year, the ICGE brought Ethical Systems, a consortium of business and behavioral ethics scholars, to the Kelley School, which doubled the number of our faculty affiliates and created an entirely new network of collaborators under the ICGE umbrella, as well as a new platform to reach business leaders. So bringing the ICGE and Ethical Systems together has created a one-of-a-kind institution that is able to harness the best academic research to aid students, scholars, policymakers, and business leaders in elevating corporate governance and ethical business practices within their organizations. So this speaker series is just one of the ways that we're doing that. So please do check out our websites and LinkedIn for new initiatives and activities coming from the ICGE and Ethical Systems in the future. And I should also mention that we recently issued our first report. So you can see everything that we've been doing over the last year. Just go to the ICGE website to take a look. All right, and now let me introduce the moderator for today's talk, my colleague and ICGE Research Director, Sunil Bedi. Sunil is an Associate Professor of Business Law and the Jerome Bess Faculty Fellow at the Kelley School. He earned his PhD in Marketing and Business Ethics from Wharton, as well as a JD from Harvard Law School. So prior to joining academia, Sunil worked as a private equity attorney at the international law firm Ropes & Gray. And as a researcher, Sunil's areas of expertise include business law and ethics, intellectual property, and brand strategy. His work often employs multiple methods, so that includes quantitative, philosophical, and experimental, to answer questions that sit at the intersection of law and strategy. His research has been published in the top law and ethics journals, including places such as the Cornell Law Review, Southern California Law Review, Vanderbilt Law Review, and the Journal of Business Ethics. Sunil is a gifted teacher and sought-after speaker, and he has an incredible ability to engage his audiences around complex areas of law, ethics, business strategy, to explore these fundamental questions for business leaders. And so we're going to do a little bit of that today. So with that, Sunil, please take it away.
Thanks, Todd. It's great to see you after being out of the office for a while, and thanks for having me moderate this talk. So I'm really excited today to introduce our speaker. His name is Abe Singer, and he's an Associate Professor of Management at the Quinlan School of Business at Loyola University, Chicago. Abe is truly an expert in all things business ethics and is one of the most sought-after leaders in the field. His work critically appraises the commercial activity and economic institutions we take for granted by considering them in light of our background institutions and our underlying moral commitments. He's written several articles in top journals like the Business Ethics, Journal of Business Ethics, Business Ethics Quarterly, the American Journal of Political Science, and the Journal of Politics. He's also written two books, the first coming out of the prestigious Oxford University Press titled The Form of the Firm, and the second, which he will be discussing more today with us, Everyone's Business, which is published by the University of Chicago Press. Abe has the unique ability to take political and moral theory and infuse those things with market principles that speak to business leaders and academics alike. He teaches classes in ethics and social responsibility. He has a BA from the University of Toronto, an MA from the University of Illinois, and a PhD in political science from the University of Toronto. Abe, thanks so much for being with us today. We're really looking forward to hearing about your new book and about your work generally at the intersection of politics and business. And let me remind all of you listeners, as we always do, if you have questions for Abe, I will be moderating a discussion later on. And please put those in the chat and we will bring those to Abe. Abe, again, great to have you here. We really appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks so much for that lovely introduction, and thank you, Sunil, Todd, and Cassidy for arranging for this and having me. I'm really excited to give the talk. I will make one small correction. It's the master's from the University of Illinois, Chicago. Go Flames. They would be very upset at me to be confused with those folks down south. So as Sunil mentioned, the talk I'm giving today, so it's called Why Business Ethics is Political. And it's sort of based around a book that came out last year that I wrote with my co-author, Amit Ron, who's at Arizona State University. And the key idea of this book is to make the claim that businesses, like the very simple way of thinking about it is that businesses have democratic obligations, that when businesses think about what they ought to do, whether from a purely business perspective, from a marketing perspective, when engaging with politicians, lobbying, all sorts of things, that they have obligations not just to their shareholders, not just to their employees, but they also have obligations to democracy at large. A way of maybe thinking about it is that the civic obligations that we as citizens have are kind of we don't take our citizen hats off when we enter the C-suite. Is maybe a very simple way of thinking about it. And so in the book, what Amit and I do is this is a quick phone grab of the table of contents, why it's so fuzzy. But we try and make the case that first, the sort of theoretical moral case that businesses should be thinking about democracy as an ethical obligation. And then we go through in different chapters, we try to sort of explain what that looks like or what that means. And how it's sort of applied in different things. So we talk about marketing, about lobbying, about addressing consumer or worker protests, and so forth. Now, today, I'm going to go into that a little bit, but my main focus is actually going to be something that sort of precedes all of that. And that's, so we'll start working. There we go. This first chapter, the name of the talk today, Business Ethics is Political. And the idea is that before you can get to the point of understanding or thinking through businesses' democratic obligations, what we owe one another and what we owe society by virtue of a commitment to democracy, we first have to sort of reorient the way we think about business and the way we think about business ethics. And what I'm going to argue for is a political way of approaching this. And the way we might contrast that, and I'll spell this out in a little more detail going forward, is to sort of disabuse ourselves of a common way of thinking about business ethics or responsibility in commerce, which is an appeal to kind of individual conscience, right? So like, I believe in my heart that this is right. And I was strong in will and I followed that. And that might be a virtuous, character trait. But what I want to argue is that doesn't fully capture what business ethics is. And to fully understand this, we have to sort of think of business as the mission of the ICGE and other ideas as an institution amongst different sorts of institutions and systems. And when we look at it that way, business ethics appears something different. And so a way of getting at this is to maybe think of, if we want to think of business ethics as a solution to a problem, we could perhaps understand a very basic dilemma at the heart of business and at the heart of the sort of ethical inquiry and normative inquiry into what business is and what business ought to be doing. And the basic dilemma can go something like this. On the one hand, businesses pursue private and non-public ends, right? Usually profit or share value, not always, but generally. This is what philosophers, the way that philosophers put this is they say businesses have a justification to appeal to partial reasons when making decisions. They're partial, not in contrast to whole or complete, but partial in contrast to impartial. Businesses get to be partial in their orientation. They get to pursue business ends through business means. So that's on the one hand, they're sort of partial organizations and partial institutions. And yet, businesses make decisions and that have consequences on interpersonal dynamics, social dynamics, and large public consequences. And generally speaking, we think that these ought to be assessed in a sort of impartial manner. That is, like, we owe things to citizens not based on who we like best or something. We have sort of general moral obligations, general social obligations. So there's this fundamental conflict with businesses as partial organizations pursuing their own business corporate ends, and yet owing things that are general, owing things to society at large, owing things to humanity at large, owing things to people irrespective of who they prefer best or what will do them or what will serve them best. And so there's this conflict between the partial and the impartial is maybe a way of thinking about it. Just as a note, as a side note, businesses aren't unique in this regard, right? Like professional bodies generally kind of have this structure, families have this structure, but business is its most pointed because the ends they're pursuing are so pecuniary, right? Like they're pursuing profit, they're pursuing shareholder value, and so this conflict is kind of given is brought into sharp relief. And so in business ethics, there's sort of three styles of response to this dilemma between the partiality of business and a sort of public-minded impartiality. And so I'm going to go through with them. I'm going to go the first two, and then the third is obviously the one that I prefer. So the first is what I like to call the "what would Kant do" approach, and this is like a very common, as Sunil and Todd can attest to. This is like a very common approach in business ethics scholarship, and the basic idea is that you start with some big moral idea, start with some big moral or ethical theory, and then you sort of treat it like, like detergent that you just apply to the corporate stain, right? So you start with what is ethics, and then you apply it to business. So you start with Kant, or you start with Aristotle, or you start with, I don't know, Jesus or whatever, and then you go like, well, I read the Metaphysics of Morals, or I read the Nicomachean Ethics, or the Sermon on the Mount, and then this tells me what to do about mergers and acquisitions or something. And so this has like a lot to recommend it, and I've learned, and this isn't, I'm saying this in a sort of facetious manner, but I don't mean to disparage people who do this. There's great merit to thinking through common practices through the lens of big moral ideas. The general problem that these sorts of approaches confront, however, is that they sort of assume that moral principles are general and universal. And they have a tendency to not take seriously the way the context, while not devoid of moral content, changes the nature of moral decision-making, or changes the moral criteria that we might use to assess different forms of action and different patterns of behavior. So on this slide, I have two pictures. So one is the famous picture of Muhammad Ali standing over Sonny Liston. And that's just to sort of symbolize that, like, Kant's categorical imperative doesn't make sense in the boxing ring, right? Like it's hard to give an account of contact sports. I mean, you can, but it's sort of, at the end of the day, you're kind of punching a guy in the face, not treating him as like a means, or not treating him as an end in himself, right? That is, there's certain contexts where we allow, for very specific reasons, idiosyncratic behavior that deviates from common sense, everyday notions of morality. And so starting from the big moral idea is kind of going to be is not going to be terribly helpful for understanding these sorts of contexts. And of course, the idea here is that business might be one of, while perhaps fewer bloody noses, might be pretty more similar to boxing than not. The other picture on this slide, so I'm joining you from Chicago, and so this is Mayor Richard Daley the first, noted boss of the Chicago Machine. And I include him because there's a famous episode that I think speaks to this idea in a very I think funny way. Is during his reign, or his administration, he at one point, as he was wont to do, gave like very, very lucrative city contracts to people he liked, including his family members. And so there's this one episode where he gives this big city contract to his son's business, and he's questioned and grilled by reporters. And his response is amazing. His response is, "But it is a father's duty to help his son." Now, what's incredible about that is he's not wrong, right? It is, in fact, parents' obligations to help their children. What he's missing, of course, is that big idea doesn't mean that as mayor you get to do that, right? That is, as mayor, you're sitting in a particular office that's governed by particular norms for a particular institution, and you're actually obligated to not be partial in this way, right? So the norms change, even though you have general obligations to help your family or whatever. When you're in this position, in this room, using the resources and power of this office, those norms, those moral duties, those moral responsibilities actually change. And so what the basic idea is, although the sort of applied moral theory, what would Kant do approach, has great merits, what we take away from its shortcomings is that we need to take roles and positions in society very seriously, because often there's moral justifications for these roles and positions that come with specific idiosyncratic permissions and obligations that don't apply generally. So that's one style of approach. The other very common way of thinking about business ethics is to appeal to fiduciary obligations, whether to shareholders, and this is famously advocated by Milton Friedman, or to stakeholders, and this has become an extremely popular, perhaps dominant view in the corporate world, which was sort of reached its apotheosis in 2019 when the Business Roundtable, in its statement on the purpose of a corporation, explicitly affirmed a stakeholder view, the idea that corporations are a value creation vehicle for all its stakeholders, not just its shareholders. Now, what's interesting about this, right, is these are often seen as like enemy positions. They're shareholder-oriented people and they're stakeholder-oriented people. But I actually tend to see them as much more similar than that. That is, they're both fiduciary-oriented positions. That is, no matter, you might disagree about what the corporation owes to whom, but the idea is that fundamentally the ethics of business is grounded in a fiduciary obligation towards some principle to which the firm or the corporation is the agent. And so this is a very common view. The problem here, and this becomes more apparent in shareholder theory, though I think it's just as apparent in stakeholder theory, is it's actually too narrow of an understanding of morality, because it tries to cash out our moral obligations just in terms of what we owe to the people who have hired us or what we owe to the people who have helped us create value. And it doesn't take seriously that we might be constrained in the way we go about pursuing those interests, right? That we might owe obligations not just to the people for whom we are fiduciaries or the parties for whom we are fiduciaries, but to others that we might affect in that process. Stakeholder theory has ways of going about trying to deal with this. I don't think they're very successful. We can talk about that more in the Q&A if we want, Sunil. But the point is that it's sort of, if we try to cash it out in just fiduciary terms, we miss something really important. And so while the fiduciary position gets something right that the what would Kant do folks don't, namely it sort of takes seriously the institution and the role of business, it's sort of too narrow in its aperture. And what we learn from this is we need to sort of not just assess roles and institutions as they are, but to situate them within broader social systems, broader institutional dynamics, and broader moral social concerns. That is, why would we have an institution like the corporation that pursues the interests of shareholders or stakeholders in such a partial manner in the first place? And what sorts of obligations does that fact give us? And so this leads us to a third approach, which I'm calling the political approach, which is obviously where I promised we would end up. And what the political approach, and there's different flavors of this, but generally what we can understand the political approach to business ethics to do is to say that we should think of roles like CEO, like business leader, like accountant, like various other positions within a business as social offices. And that these social offices, like that of the mayor, like that of I was going to say president. I'm not sure that that's the case right now, but like various social and political offices that are held in society, these come with special privileges and special responsibilities that are underwritten by their social function and their social purpose. So it sort of takes the institutional part of the fiduciary school seriously, and takes the sort of grander moral ideas of the what would Kant do folks seriously, and tries to blend them to say, like, let's take seriously why this institution exists within a background of a larger social commitment to certain political and social values and objectives. And so for business, what this cashes out to, no pun intended, is we get a justification for business partiality, for profit seeking. And the idea is that it's justified by its contribution to an efficient economy. That is, given the right context, given the right background and framework, when businesses pursue profit, they kind of have to do things for other people in the process that other people want, and in doing so, they contribute to allocative efficiency. Of course, in the real world, it's a lot more messy and complicated than this, but this would sort of be the implicit justification for why we have an economy dominated by profit-seeking businesses in the first place, right? That in the right context, doing this actually leads to social value and leads to social goods in various ways. However, and this is sort of speaking to that imperfection, that this pursuit of profit, this pursuit of partial interests, this partiality of business is limited. And it's limited in the first case by law. So there's laws that sort of say you can pursue profit in these ways and you can't in these ways. But it's also limited by ethical restraint. And this ethical restraint is informed by some notion of the social good. And by this, I mean it in a sort of narrow way, right? The idea is that if the justification for business is that it contributes to the economic value of society, that it helps allocate resources effectively to where they're best used, then when businesses pursue profit in ways that undercut this, say by polluting, say by lying to customers, say by cheating their employees, then they're actually undermining the very purpose of why we have these institutions in the first place. And as a consequence, they're acting unethically, right? They're acting in ways that aren't, that like their role don't justify, right? The fact that we give a boxer the right to punch somebody in the face in the ring doesn't mean they get to punch the referee, is maybe a very simple way of thinking about it. And similarly, although we allow businesses to pursue profit, it doesn't mean they get to use any means to do so. And they're ethically constrained by certain notions of the social good. Now, this, of course, raises a question, which is, what is the social good? And this is complicated for a number of reasons, and I'll just focus on one right now. It's complicated by what John Rawls, the great American 20th century philosopher, once referred to as the fact of reasonable pluralism. That in a free society where people are, broadly free to pursue their own ends and to assess ways of life as they wish, society is going to be constituted by a pluralism of values and life goals. And so as a consequence, we actually can't assume that everybody in a society wants the same things. We have to assume that everybody in society kind of wants different stuff, wants different things out of life, wants different things to do with their free times, assesses things differently in various ways. And this leads to a principle in political philosophy, which is called the principle of liberal neutrality. The idea that both laws and public policy, but also public morality, ought to be neutral with respect to how different people pursue their life's projects, right? So this is, in America, this is most famously articulated in the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, that the state will establish no church, right? The idea being that the state shouldn't be in the business of picking amongst the various ethical approaches that people live their lives. It shouldn't be in the habit of picking one and instituting it and forcing people to comply with it. Now, for business ethics, that presents this big problem, right? Because as I said, businesses need to, be constrained by a certain notion of the social good. And yet we are not just, we have to be mindful of the fact that people assess the good and bad very differently from one another. And if we are going to be impartial towards everybody and treat everybody equally, how are we going to manage this? In political philosophy, there's two ideas that have come out on this score. One is to appeal to rules that are implicit to systems of cooperation. I'm not going to talk about this so much right now, but it sort of goes back to what I was saying before, that if the existence of business is justified by its ability to contribute to efficiency, then activities that undermine efficiency, like, say, polluting the Chicago River or engaging in false advertising or whatever, would violate a rule that's implicit to the structure of market cooperation. So that's one way that we're approaching it. But the other, and this is the other crucial development over the past 300 years, is we said, given the fact that we all disagree about stuff, what we need to do is figure out ways of making decisions together, which is why democracy becomes so important, right? That democracy is one of the crucial mechanisms and procedures that we use to make decisions, to make judgments in a society marked by an inexorable pluralism, a society where we can't assume we all agree. And so we have to kind of come together and hash things out. And so, so just to sort of give us where we are, I have about 10 minutes left. Is we should think about business ethics not as just something that's our individual conscious and not something derived from Mount Sinai, or just like that exists, just whatever business wants us to do. That it's sort of that business ethics is fundamentally the set of rules, responsibilities, obligations, and permissions that attach to the office of business person. And the idea is that office is justified by the role it serves in pursuing the common good, and is also limited ethically and legally by ways in which it can run afoul of that basic justification. And this leads us to the the sort of importance of democracy, because democracy is one of the ways we try to one of the major procedures that we use to negotiate and to reach decisions and considerations about how to understand what the good is that we are all contributing to in this messy, pluralistic, disagreeable society. If we understand democracy as crucial in this way, then we have to recognize that business can be very threatening to the functioning of a healthy and vibrant democracy. And one sort of idea that I want to introduce here is an idea that democratic theorists emphasize a lot, which is a distinction between first and second order judgments. This is, we'll see why it's important for democracy in a second. But first order judgments are judgments about specific moral rules or certain moral cases, right? So what Israel's doing in Gaza is wrong, right? Or we ought to adopt this economic policy or whatever. That's a first order judgment. I'm making a judgment about a particular case or about a particular thing or advocating for a particular law. Second order judgments and second order rules are judgments and rules that relate to how we go about making first order judgments and rules, right? So to reach the determination about, and these are all chosen at random, but to reach the determination that I made about Israel and Gaza, we ought to assess evidence in a dispassionate manner, run things through standing international bodies or whatever. The idea is those are second order rules that help us reach those first order rules in the correct way. Or we ought to have some economic policy. The idea is economic policy ought to be set by independent agencies, Congress, et cetera, that are themselves rule bound in how they go about doing these things, right? So first order is about the rules and judgments themselves. Second order are about how we go about making those rules and judgments, is a very simple way of thinking about it. And the idea is that democracy is largely about second order rules. That given the fact that we disagree fundamentally, that society is marked by pluralism, we require standing second order rules to reach these final decisions and judgments. And we could sort of say democracy is made up, at the very least, people have literally been debating democracy for millennia, and what it means and what it requires. We can say at a minimum, democracy requires these three things: formal mechanisms of accountability, most famously embodied in elections and representative government. Second, free expression and open exchange of ideas, what's sometimes called the ability and the means to engage in political deliberation. And third, the ability to, and this is sort of derived from number two, but the ability to engage in protest, the ability to challenge things that exist that are put forward in a legal and safe manner. Now, if we think about democracy as entailing these sort of second order rules and second order judgments, then we have to recognize that businesses, by virtue of their place in society, are in a position to corrupt, but also just to affect the way these three things work, right? So businesses obviously have great monetary influence that are, through that monetary influence, they're able to affect the formal mechanisms of accountability, right? They're able to contribute to elections and alter the way candidates are elected. They're able to lobby and affect the way candidates go about making rules, or the legislators go about making rules, the way independent agencies go about enforcing policies, and so on. They have social and cultural influence, both through celebrity, as we see with folks like Elon Musk, for example, but also through marketing and other PR campaigns and PR mechanisms that businesses have, where they're able to sort of, put ideas out into the ether in ways that other actors in society aren't able to. And in this way, sort of affect the way the expression, the open exchange of ideas is actually run and how it actually comes about. And of course, businesses, and this is especially true for large corporations, are governance institutions themselves, and therefore have organizational power over people that affect the way they are able to live lives that are consistent and to go about engaging in democratic citizenship. So all of which is to say is, by businesses, by virtue of the position they hold in society, on the one hand, we allow them to pursue profit for various reasons that we think will produce social goods. They are constrained, in the way they do this, by virtue of the fact that they can do this in ways that don't contribute to economic value. But they also ought to be constrained by virtue of the way they can upend and undermine the second order rules that we use to determine what we as a society are doing, namely the procedures and principles of democratic governance. And what's important about that, and this is a really important point, is that this can be true even when businesses and business people think they're acting benevolently, right? That is, the fact that you are that you're thinking good thoughts, right? That you want to help people, kind of doesn't obviate the democratic worry. Why? Because when you're doing that, you are pursuing a certain policy, you're pursuing a certain way of going about things in a decidedly unequal manner. That is, you're going about doing things and you're having this influence by virtue of the money or institutional standing you have, not through the normal and appropriate democratic mechanisms for doing so. And so there's a degree to which, like, the fact that you think you're doing right or you're trying to do right is not enough. That there's a certain, that is to say, you're using your first order judgments when what you ought to be doing is respecting the second order rules of democracy. And so in the book, we give what we call 3 principles of democratic business ethics. And then throughout the book, try to explain what they look like in different contexts. And the idea is that these are principles that businesses ought to abide in order to show the proper respect for the second order rules of democratic decision-making and democratic governance of democratic society. So I'm going to go over these and give you some examples, and then we'll end it there. And then Sunil and I can talk a bit more about sort of the cash value of these things. So the 3 principles that we derive are first, the duty to democratic outcomes, second, the duty to reflection, and third, the duty to publicity. And so the duty to democratic outcomes is essentially a broad obligation to follow the rules that are created through a legal democratic process. That legal part is very important. That is, generally speaking, and there's always like examples we can find where that might not be the case, but generally speaking, businesses ought not to break laws. It's sort of the very simple way of putting it. But maybe even more importantly, that they have the obligation generally to follow the spirit of the laws and not try to game the system, not try to find loopholes, not use their legal team to figure out ways of gaming these things in all of these ways, that they have an obligation to respect the outcomes of the democratic process. And so here, this is a screen grab of a famous case from a few years ago where documents internal to Uber came alight, where they basically showed kind of what everybody already knew, which is that when Uber was expanding into various cities, that they did so knowing full well that it was illegal, right? That they did so actively to undermine city law and city ordinances that forbid these sorts of ride-sharing practices to happen. And so you could sort of justify about whether you could get into an argument about whether in the end that worked out or whether it was okay. But what we want to say is this sort of disposition to doing that, to thinking of rules as just so many financial obstacles that you need to clear before you can get what you want, is a fundamentally undemocratic and unethical way of approaching rule and law and government for businesses. That businesses, if you want to change the rule, you should go through the normal democratic process of trying to appeal to people, trying to introduce legislative change, and so forth, not by just flouting the law as Uber straightforwardly did. Interestingly enough, Uber also tried to say that they were acting in the spirit of Rosa Parks when they did this. Like, we are also engaging in civil disobedience, because they're the same thing. So that's the duty to democratic outcomes, right? To respect both the law and the spirit of the law. And as we describe in the book, to kind of respect generally a culture of the rule of law. Third, second, I'm going in a slightly different order, is the duty to publicity. And so that is the idea that when you make decisions, these should be as scrutable and open to public oversight as possible. So not repairing too quickly to propriety, to sort of propriety, to explain why you get to do something. That actually, to the extent that businesses make decisions that affect society, their business is society's business. This doesn't mean society gets like an ownership stake, but it means that when you make decisions that have large public consequences, these should be as open as possible to public scrutiny. And just an example from the past week that sort of speaks to how easy it is for businesses to run afoul of this. So a while ago, Meta was introducing facial recognition tech to its like smart AI glasses that it's trying to introduce, and people were like, understandably not cool with that. And so they said, "Oh yeah, we're not going to do that anymore. You're right." And some of you probably saw this, but the New York Times obtained internal memos that basically said, "Hey, look, right now, society's really focusing on all sorts of other stuff. You got ICE, you got the Middle East, you got all sorts of things. So right now, we can introduce these glasses and nobody will notice, right?" And while that's maybe smart from a strategy perspective, what I want to suggest is that this is like a deeply undemocratic and deeply unethical way of going about doing these things, precisely because this is a decision that ought to be at least known and I think open to scrutiny and criticism by the public that it will end up affecting dearly. And then finally, what we call the duty to reflection. And that's sort of been implicit from the other two, but it's the idea that when businesses reason and try to come to decisions, that they should do so not just in financial terms, not just in marketing terms, not just in human, in HR terms, but that they also have an obligation to think about the way their actions affect democracy. And this is actually a weightier demand than it might seem, because I think, that it might require creating particular offices and divisions of labor within corporations to make sure that these reflections are happening. But just to give an example, so I'm sure many of you have been following the Anthropic State Department showdown that's been going on the past week or two. And I'm like hugely skeptical of AI and find it very, very like anxiety provoking. But I did find Anthropic's refusal to do what Hegseth was asking to be quite compelling. But even more than just the decision, what's important is the idea, and you can sort of see it in there. He sort of says, we believe AI can undermine rather than defend democratic values. And when it can do that, we shouldn't be engaging with it, right? That is, what they did was actually try to think about what their technologies and what their products are doing, not just for their clients, but also for democracy at large, and trying to both reflect on it, offer justifications for it, and then act upon it. And we can note that not every AI company felt the same way or engages in this sort of reflection. And so these are just a few examples of the way this sort of thinking about business ethics as political, and thinking that this political orientation requires a concern for the type of influence that businesses wield in democracy. These are just examples of the way this can cash out in terms of actual business practice. And I'm excited to talk about that a little bit more with Sunil. So thank you guys so much. Again, the book is Everyone's Business, University of Chicago Press. It's out in paperback. And thank you for joining me.
Sweet. Thank you so much, Abe. That was wonderful. I think should we have Abe keep up his slide, or should we?
Yeah, Abe,
Yeah.
you can put it down or keep it up, whatever.
Whatever
Maybe you want to put it down so we can have a conversation.
Yeah. See you then.
There you go.
So Abe, let me see if I can just sort of recap where we are, and then I have a couple questions, many questions, and people are sort of blowing me up here too. So it's great. We have a lot of
I've got some questions too.
There we go.
I got a
Great.
couple too.
Great. So as I understand it, Abe, what you've done for us very clearly is sort of make the case that businesses ought to care about democracy. That democracy, particularly as you've laid out, matters a lot to businesses, and businesses ought to be thinking about their role in democratic institutions and what role they play. So here's the first question to get us started. Your slide talks about businesses as a threat to democracy. And I wonder, what is the difference, if any, for you of businesses being a threat to democracy, but also businesses being a fruitful avenue to protect democracy? And one of the ways to think about that is, negative and positive obligations. A lot of what you told us was these are things businesses ought not to do. Are there things that businesses ought to do to actually, or they have an obligation to do to promote democracy? How might you think about those two different conceptions of business interactions with democracy?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So it should have been businesses as potential threats to democracy. Though I guess I want to say that potential is always there, right? And it's just grounded in just if you think of democracy as fundamentally committed to some forms of equality, particularly a political equality, not just formal in terms of everybody can vote, but also a type of general equality in terms of the way we can participate in democratic discourse in the activities of citizenship, then the fact that there are these institutions that are able to amass this sort of power, and to be clear, businesses aren't the only form of institution like this that we need to worry about. But like to the extent that we have these institutions and they're licensed to be so, then we should be anxious about the way in which they can affect democracy just by virtue of being powerful. Right, like it, so in some ways it's kind of, and that's sort of what I was getting at before, in some ways like the motivation isn't even the problem is like you in fact have more power than other people, and how you wield that is going to have, it just has significance for democracy. Now I take your point though, of course, that doesn't mean businesses are always, and you know, something Amit and I are careful to do is we don't say therefore businesses should just stay out of politics, full stop, because we actually don't think that's possible. Right, like if you move your company to, I don't know, Florida or China or whatever, like there are just inherent political consequences of these sorts of things, right? When you're doing this, when you enter into partnerships with people, these have political consequences. So politics isn't something that businesses can remove themselves from or be quarantined out of. So in some ways, even though I was focusing on a kind of negativity, the point is like those don't do this lead to positive obligations that businesses have, right? Namely, to be public and candid with one's influence, right? I also think, you know, in terms of the duty to democratic outcomes, businesses have an obligation to. So first, I think businesses might have a. How do I want to say this? Not might. They do have a very qualified obligation or responsibility to stand up to illegal actions that are done in democracy's name. Now, the reason why I'm being very careful.
Sorry, Abe. Sorry, Abe. I got to jump in on that. So this is, and I want to ask this question. So does Target have a responsibility and obligation to, you know, keep ICE out of its stores, for example, right? If or not stage in its parking lot, right? Like where's the line? And then how do we also make that distinction between, many people in our country might think that's a good thing. Many people might think that's a bad thing. So how does a company and its leaders then have an obligation to go out and explain what they're doing and talk about it and make affirmative statements in that regard?
Yeah. So you got right to all the qualifications I was about to get to. So and just to be clear, so in the book, we make the argument that businesses generally shouldn't be participating in things like civil disobedience, that businesses aren't well positioned to exercise the sorts of judgment where they get to say this law is unjust, therefore I don't get to do it. We can think of all sorts of examples where we might like them to do that, and then we can think about like Elon Musk opening Tesla during quarantine lockdowns or whatever, like all sorts of things where these are appealed to in very strategic and cynical manners. So generally speaking, we think businesses ought to respect the law. But with the question of ICE, which is exactly what I'm thinking of and what sort of where these reflections came from in talking to students, right? Must businesses let ICE in? I think it really matters how ICE is approaching how ICE, right? Like if ICE is approaching without a warrant or with the duplicitous warrants and the fake warrants that they've been known to use to round up people without due process, I think businesses are well within their right now to refuse them entry, and to not allow them to stage. Now, whether they're obligated to do that at the cost of their own livelihood or something, I think that's maybe a trickier question. So I probably spoke a little too quickly before, but I think they are permitted to do that, and that doesn't run afoul of democratic obligations they have. Does that help answer questions?
Yeah, no, okay. Absolutely. And I imagine there's, when I asked the question, we got a bunch more other questions, so I want to make sure.
Yeah. I think a lot of people in the chat are sort of grappling with this, Abe, which is you're saying, don't break the law, which makes sense. But what if the law is unjust? What if the sort of CEO believes the law to be unjust? Does that sort of just collapse into do whatever you want to do? And I think what you're, in the book, you sort of talk about, no civil disobedience, but then you sort of carve out when civil disobedience might be justified. And so maybe you want to just slightly touch on that. I know it's sort of a very complicated argument, but if you want to give the sort of just broad strokes conditions on, well, when can a company sort of engage in what we would consider as civil disobedience?
Yeah, so the argument is basically to go over theories of civil disobedience as articulated most famously by Martin Luther King Jr., but also John Rawls and others in this tradition, which is just one tradition of civil disobedience, which says that laws can be broken, but the point is that you have to break laws in the spirit and in pursuance of lawfulness, right? So King very famously says, like, yes, we broke the law here, but we did it after going through these 4 steps, right? So it's like negotiation, research, purification, and then direct action.
Mm-hmm.
And the argument is basically like the point is that those processes are important because they're ways of ensuring that when you're breaking the law, you're not breaking the rule of law, is essentially a way of doing it, right? You're holding the law to a higher legal account is maybe like a very simple way of thinking about it. And the argument is just the way businesses are structured, the way business decision making is structured and incentivized. Businesses are just generally not in a good position to make those judgments. That is, they're not in a position to go about the various stages that are required to render civil disobedience legitimate and lawful. And so therefore, like, they generally ought to refrain. That being said, of course, I can think every time we do this, somebody goes like, well, what about, the Fugitive Slave Act or whatever, like in Nazi Germany, there's obviously examples that are so extraordinary or so horrific or so just patently unjust that I wouldn't want to say like never, absolutely. But the point is that businesses ought not to cultivate the disposition of trying to make these judgments in the first place, because they should recognize that they're just not generally well institutionally situated to do that.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
Yeah, you've read the book more recently than me, Sunil. Did that accurately describe?
No, I think that's absolutely right. I think that's absolutely right. I'm going to take my moderator duties very seriously here and inject a question that I have when I sort of read your book. So I'm a marketing guy, Abe, and you spend a lot of time, or at least a chapter, talking about companies taking social and political positions outwardly. And we've seen this in the past 10, 15, even 20 years, where in the you would be able to tell me better, but in the 1970s, 80s, maybe companies didn't really sort of comment on what's going on in politics and social sort of apparatus. Today, or at least 5 years ago, now things have changed a little bit. It's like every company feels like they must. And not only do they feel like they must, consumers are punishing companies when they don't take positions or when they take positions they don't like. What does your account, businesses interaction with democracy, what does that account say about companies publicly, marketing-wise, taking these sorts of political positions or coming out one way or another on what's going on in politics?
Yeah, I mean, 5 years ago, we all found out what our businesses, every hotel you ever stayed at or got a sandwich from or whatever told you that they were against whatever racism or again, they're deep cleaning, whatever. Like they all listed all of their big social and political values in their emails, right? So yeah, the idea is the marketing chapter is broadly concerned with the importance of deliberation in a democratic society. That is the importance for enabling citizens to exchange reasons with one another, so that they can come to more reasoned understandings of what we ought to do policy and politically and legally. And the idea is that marketing, given its ubiquity and given its tendency to not use reason but to use persuasion, can often interfere with that process of deliberation, both in terms of the facts and the ideas that gain currency in deliberative society, but also by affecting the orientation of people and how they approach politics as consumers as opposed to as citizens. And so when it comes to the idea of using political positions as marketing, I mean, so again, the duty to publicity says, if you are doing these things, you should be as public as possible with the reasons for why you're doing so. Mm-hmm. So something like Anthropic, and I saw in the Q&A, somebody pointed out that they're back at the table with DoD. So it's not obvious that they're even fulfilling this obligation. I'm fine with that. Again, I kind of hate all AI companies, so I'm totally cool with them not living up to my ethical thing. But the point is, that's at least the pretense of following that duty of publicity, because it's trying to give reasons and arguments for a position. Mm-hmm. To the extent that in marketing we use political positions in a very instrumental manner, we find this to be troubling from a democratic perspective for a couple of reasons. So one is we just sort of think it's a cynical use of political ideas and social movements. And we take social movements to be an important part of democratic society. And so there's like a certain way in which just sort of using these in a very instrumental, cynical, and conditional manner is to sort of treat them in the wrong way. But more importantly, the problem with that is it orients consumers to also approach these political ideas in a similarly instrumental and cynical manner, right? When the NFL puts Black Lives Matter on the end zone of whatever, like there are, you can think of a million different examples. There was that, was it a Pepsi ad where it was like somebody going to a protest and giving somebody a Pepsi or something?
Yeah, right.
It doesn't help people take seriously the claims that are being put forward by different political movements, right? Quite the contrary. It encourages a very cynical way of approaching these things. This isn't to say all social movements or political positions are correct, not at all, but that they warrant being dealt with on those terms, not being treated in this manner, and not being and we ought not to encourage people to treat politics as a sort of cynical, instrumental, calculated endeavor.
I think that makes sense. We have a lot of questions,
Yeah,
which is great.
yeah.
Let me read one that I think is quite fascinating. So, this person says, if businesses are expected to align with democratic principles, how should we think about platforms like Kalshi? Kalshi, is that how you pronounce it?
Kalshi,
Kalshi. That allow markets on political or regulatory outcomes? Do they strengthen democratic participation through information and pricing signals, or they risk turning political processes into speculative assets? I think that's kind of interesting. Like, what if the business model itself is doing something with respect to democracy, right? What do you think about that?
It's such a great question. I find these sorts of proposition markets like fascinating and troubling. And then somebody who also, is occasionally puts a wager on a Knicks game here or there, like just sort of fascinating. So it's a bigger question than I'm probably qualified to answer, just because I don't fully understand all of the dynamics of the way these businesses work. That being said, so I actually really I find it interesting, like the idea that this can have pro-democratic qualities in terms of encouraging interest, right? Yeah. When, we have an entire ecosystem dedicated to sports journalism, perhaps in some ways because there is a large gambling market for sports, right? The information in Vegas is very good on sports. And so if we have, prop markets for political policy and stuff like this, then maybe this encourages information gathering that's pro-democratic. And I think there might be something to that. That being said, I think it does something that we really ought to be very resistant to in democracies, which is thinking of democracy as this individual endeavor, this thing that just I do to get what I want. And I approach this thing in a way that's instrumental, that I'm come from a school of thought that takes very seriously that democracy has to include a we. And that we ought to be, when we're thinking about democracy, we need institutions and procedures that promote a collectiveness, a way of thinking about and approaching problems in some collective spirit. And I do worry, I have very strong worries that these sorts of businesses don't contribute to that, and in fact undermine that in very significant ways.
Yeah, no, totally. So this wouldn't be a corporate governance and ethics talk if we didn't talk a little bit about corporate governance itself specifically. So, and people have raised this, but this is also a question I had when sort of reading the book, and you touch on this a little bit, but I'd love to hear sort of your thoughts on this. Two sort of aspects of corporate governance. On the one hand, if we think that corporations and businesses ought to sort of contribute or at least not be threats to democracy, how do they structure their own corporate governance in a way that's democratic, right? And here you could think about employees on boards, or how does the business itself think about itself as part of a democracy? That's the first thing. And the second sort of corporate governance question is, how do corporations think about sort of setting up departments so that those departments are telling marketing, telling finance, hey, what you're doing is violating sort of Abe Singer's sort of a theory of business ethics. So those are slightly different questions, but they're sort of about structuring of the corporation itself.
No, it's. I think I really appreciate the way you phrased it, because my response was going to sort of get at exactly those two prongs of ways of thinking about this, right? So when we're thinking about the governance of firms and corporations with respect to democracy, there's two dimensions we can think about this. So one is firms as governments themselves and what democracy demands of governments in an economy. And then the second is firms as actors in a society and how the governance can affect their actions.
Mm.
So in the first case, so I've written about this in a previous book, this book, Form of the Firm, that you mentioned. I make the argument that we ought to have a general social preference for worker participation, worker decision making, and even worker ownership. I don't go as far as some of my other colleagues to say like all companies must be legally mandatory worker cooperatives, but that we ought to actually build equivalents to Wall Street, SEC, and Delaware courts that help facilitate shareholder-owned corporations, that we ought to create similar institutions that can help facilitate worker-owned cooperatives. But sort of even aside from that, just generally, the sort of general idea there is that business leaders ought to recognize that the authority they wield within business is not justified by the employment, is not fully legitimated by the employment contract, and that you still owe people under your rule who are following orders you give, you owe them various sorts of regard, not, other than just to pay them, right? So Don Draper is wrong. That's what the money is for, does not actually solve all the questions, right? And I think this leads to certain more radical democratic, intra-firm democracy, but even if you don't go all the way there, we ought to see workers and other stakeholders as having an entitlement to some sort of say or influence in how firms are governed. So that's one side. That's the firms as government side. But the second, as you're pointing out, is when we say businesses have obligations to not affect democracy in this way, or businesses have obligations to not undermine the rules implicit to a market economy or whatever, that doesn't mean anything unless you structure business in a way to get people to act in this way. So I come from I'm very influenced by theories of cognitive science and moral philosophy that sort of say, when we think about moral action, just what the belief you hold in your heart is not going to determine your behavior, that it's actually very important to structure the context and your environment to help facilitate you to do the right thing, right? So you shouldn't eat the cookies, but the way you help do that is by putting the cookies on the top shelf so you're not tempted. So how can we structure our business environments to get us to do the right thing, to have a tendency to do the better thing as opposed to the worst thing? Now here, unfortunately, I actually am also of the opinion that general rules and general statements are not to be had here, that a lot of this stuff actually needs to be figured out by people working in the businesses themselves. So this is something I do with my MBA students, where I have them identify an ethical dilemma that they confront, explain, justify morally what they ought to do in that dilemma, but then come up with like institutional and organizational fixes that can help them, tie themselves to the mast when they're faced with this dilemma down the road. So, but some general tools in this kit, big ones are things like split decision-making power. So making sure that certain decisions can't be made unilaterally by certain decisions and that they have to actually go through other people, other parties. So when the marketing person has to consult so-and-so down the hall, I wouldn't want to call them the singer person, but somebody who with these sorts of things in mind, that they actually have some say, they have veto perhaps, or they have some influence in these decisions. And really, and you might even get even more nitty gritty that you can't do that over email. You actually have to walk to their office to do that, right? The change of I take physical space to be extremely important in these ways. So this can't be done by email. This has to involve a special room where we go and actually talk about these things, the room where it happens, so to speak. And so these sorts of inclusion of outside parties in boards of directors or decision making, instituting pauses on decision making, right? So when you're doing things that you actually say, oh, we're not allowed to make this decision right away. We are required a 48 hour or 1 week cool off period before we make the decision. The idea here is oftentimes we can feel like we're impelled or we must do things because time horizons seem so urgent. And sometimes making sure an outsider comes in and gives their perspectives, or sometimes just forcing us to pause, can actually institutionally and organizationally help us achieve the results that we ought to be achieving and ought to be pursuing. But what those look like in any particular business is going to differ, I believe.
Yeah, and that's a perfect segue and actually ties back to our prior speaker, Ruth Schmidt, who talked a lot about positive friction and trying to introduce that from sort of a behavioral cognitive science way. So we are unfortunately at 1 o'clock, believe it or not. This is probably more questions than I think we tend to have. So it's fantastic. A lot of people interested in both your book and your talk. So thank you. I think it's one for the moment in particular, the talk and the book. Try to think about sort of democratic principles and how organizations and companies can both impact them, but also live within that ecosystem. So thank you so much. And for everyone who is watching, don't forget, we have 2 more speakers coming up as part of our ICGE speaker series. Generally happens on the first Thursday of the month. So if you just check out the website, you'll see who's coming up next. And with that, have a good day, and thank you all for joining us. Take care.